Did Moses write the Pentateuch? Is Abraham ibn Ezra a forerunner of the documentary hypothesis? Abraham ibn Ezra, who lived 1089 to 1164, a renowned medieval Jewish scholar and commentator, identified certain passages in the Pentateuch that he believed were not authored by Moses. While tradition attributes the Torah to Moses, Ibn Ezra's observations suggested the presence of later additions, challenging the notion of exclusive Mosaic authorship. Joel Baden says in his book, The Composition of the Pentateuch, on page 13. Of particular note is the great medieval commentator Abraham ibn Ezra, who identified, in addition to the entire last chapter of Deuteronomy, a few other verses that he thought it improbable, if not impossible, for Moses to have written. The book, Who Wrote the Bible, from Richard Elliot Friedman, on page 19. But, ironically, Ibn Ezra himself included several enigmatic comments in his own writings that hint that he had doubts of his own. He alluded to several biblical passages that appeared not to be from Moses' own hand. What are the arguments of Ibn Ezra? Abraham ibn Ezra quoted this phrase, "on the other side of the Jordan," as a doubt of Mosaic authorship. This phrase is taken from Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 5. The phrase "on the other side," also translated with across or beyond the Jordan, is frequently cited as evidence against Moses' authorship of Deuteronomy. Some argue that this phrase implies the writer was already inside the land of Israel, west of the Jordan River. Since Moses never entered the land of Israel, they conclude that he could not have been the author of Deuteronomy, and that an unknown writer must have written it instead. The argument is as follows. If Moses and the Israelites were east of the Jordan River, and the writer speaks from a perspective west of the Jordan, then the author could not have been Moses. How can it be explained? J.P.U. Lilly, in his article By the Riverside, argues that the Hebrew word translated as across or beyond actually means beside the Jordan. The phrase across the Jordan, beyond the Jordan, or beside the Jordan does not inherently specify a geographical location. Furthermore, determining the specific location requires additional geographical information. The phrase itself does not indicate a particular side of the river. It must be clarified by context. Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 5 states, "On this side of the Jordan in the land of Moab." New King James Version. The land of Moab is east of the Jordan, confirming that Moses was on the eastern side when addressing the Israelites. There are additional geographical clarifications in Deuteronomy. Other passages in Deuteronomy chapters 1, 3, 4, and 11 consistently include additional phrases to specify the geographical location. This further supports the idea that the phrase across or beyond the Jordan is not meant to indicate a position relative to the land of Israel, but rather requires contextual clarification. In conclusion, the following can be said. The phrase across or beyond the Jordan is best understood as meaning beside the Jordan. It does not, by itself, specify which side of the river is being referenced. The writer of Deuteronomy had not yet crossed the Jordan, and the phrase does not contradict Moses' authorship. The phrase across or beyond the Jordan does not negate the authorship of Moses. Abraham ibn Ezra also alluded to the third-person writing style of Moses. The use of third-person references to Moses in the Pentateuch is often cited as an argument against his authorship. Phrases such as, "the Lord said to Moses," or "Moses wrote this law" appear frequently, leading some such as Baruch Spinoza to argue that Moses could not have been the author, since he is spoken of in the third person rather than using I. However, could Moses have intentionally used the third-person style? Writing in the third person was a common literary convention among ancient historians. Consider the following examples. Hecataeus of Miletus begins his historical work by identifying himself in the third person. Herodotus, known as the father of history, also narrates his accounts using third-person references. Thucydides starts the Peloponnesian War with a third-person self-reference. Xenophon, a student of Socrates, records his own experiences in Anabasis using third-person narration. Julius Caesar refers to himself in the third person throughout the Gallic War. Josephus, in War of the Jews, presents himself as a participant in historical events while writing in the third person. Clearly, the use of third-person narration was a standard approach among ancient historians, often employed to maintain an objective and authoritative tone. Moses was not the only biblical writer to use the third-person style. Jeremiah refers to himself in the third person approximately 130 times in his book. Daniel does so about 60 times. Joshua refers to himself in the third person around 160 times. This stylistic choice was not unique to Moses, but was commonly used by biblical authors. Why use the third person? Ancient writers, both secular and biblical, employed third-person narration to present their accounts with a sense of objectivity and authority, emphasize that their writings were not personal reflections, but divinely inspired messages, maintain a historical and documentary tone rather than a personal memoir. In summary, the use of third-person references in the Pentateuch does not contradict Mosaic authorship. Rather, it aligns with the literary style of both ancient historians and other biblical writers. It is best understood as an intentional editorial choice by Moses himself, reinforcing the divine authority of his writings rather than serving as evidence against his authorship. Let's have a look at another objection of the authorship of Moses. The death of Moses. What was Abraham ibn Ezra's opinion of the death of Moses? He believed Joshua wrote about it. According to Jewish tradition, as recorded in the Babylonian Talmud Bava Batra 14b, Joshua Moses' trusted successor wrote not only his own book, but also the final 8 verses of the Torah, which describe Moses' death. But why is this a reasonable explanation? Consider Joshua's close relationship with Moses. He served as Moses' assistant for over 40 years. He accompanied Moses partway up Mount Sinai when the first set of laws was given. He assisted at the tent of meeting, where Moses communicated with God. Given Joshua's deep familiarity with Moses, it would have been natural for him to write in a style consistent with Moses' own. Some argue that the writing style in Deuteronomy 34 matches the rest of the book, supporting this theory. In summary, the description of Moses' death doesn't require to assume the involvement of unknown authors. Joshua, who knew Moses intimately and worked alongside him for decades, was fully capable of recording these final verses in a manner consistent with the rest of the Torah. Abraham ibn Ezra also quoted this phrase, "before any king reigned in Israel," as a doubt of Mosaic authorship. This is an often used argument against the authorship of Moses. Some argue that this passage could not have been written before the establishment of the kingdom of Israel, citing Genesis 36:31. And these are the kings that reigned in the land of Edom, before there reigned any king over the children of Israel. At first glance, this verse appears to suggest that it was written after Israel had already had kings, implying a post-Mosaic authorship. But does the text truly support this conclusion? The pulpit commentary offers insight into this issue, pointing out that the original Hebrew does not indicate a past tense, as if Israelite kings had already ruled. A more literal translation reads, "before the reigning of a king for the children of Israel." This grammatical structure does not imply that kings had already ruled in Israel at the time of writing. The original Hebrew doesn't imply Israel had kings already. It's a statement about the timing relative to Edom's kings, not Israel's past. Instead, it aligns with the expectation of a future monarchy, as seen in Deuteronomy 17:14. "I will appoint a king over me like all the nations who are around me." Thus, Israel anticipated having kings in the future, and Genesis 36:31 appears to reference that expectation rather than a historical reality. In summary, the Hebrew text does not indicate that Israel had already had kings. The expectation of future kingship was already established in Israelite thought. Genesis 36:31 does not necessitate a post-Mosaic authorship. There is nothing in the original Hebrew words expressive of past tense or indicating that a king had reigned already in Israel. Israel expects kings in the future. In summary, Genesis 36:31 does not support that Israel had kings already. Before the reigning of any king in Israel does not negate the authorship of Moses. Abraham ibn Ezra also quoted the King Og's bed as a doubt of Mosaic authorship. Deuteronomy 3:11 states, "For only Og king of Bashan remained of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the children of Ammon?" American Standard Version. Some argue that this verse contradicts Mosaic authorship, suggesting that the mention of King Og's bed implies it was an ancient relic, and that Og had been dead for a long time when the text was written. However, Deuteronomy 3:3 states, "So Jehovah our God delivered into our hand Og also, the king of Bashan, and all his people, and we smote him until none was left to him remaining." American Standard Version. The entire chapter recounts events from the same year, indicating that King Og's bed was not an ancient artifact, but a contemporary object at the time of writing. The bedstead may have only been a year old when last used. Moses would have been aware of this, as the conquest of the east side of the Jordan occurred during his lifetime. Iron in the Bronze Age. Though uncommon, iron artifacts from Moses' time, such as those referenced in Ugaritic texts, indicate that the term may not be anachronistic. The iron bedstead could reflect a rare, symbolic object rather than common technology. In summary, the reference to King Og's bed in Deuteronomy 3 does not provide a definitive reason to consider it a post-Mosaic addition. The claim that this verse contradicts Moses' authorship is based on broader scholarly discussions about the composition of Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch, rather than the bed itself. Therefore, the mention of King Og's bed does not negate Mosaic authorship. Abraham ibn Ezra quoted this phrase, "The Canaanites were then in the land," as a doubt of Mosaic authorship. The text is taken from Genesis chapter 12 verse 6. Some argue that the reference to the Canaanites suggests the text was written at a later time, after the Canaanites were no longer present in the land. Therefore, it is proposed that this verse may have been added by an editor or redactor at a later period. Could Moses have written about it? Let's examine the context in which the phrase, "and the Canaanite was then in the land," appears. When Abram first arrived in Canaan, he observed that the land was already inhabited by the Canaanites, meaning he could not immediately take possession of it. Critics suggest that the phrase, "the Canaanites were then in the land," implies it was written at a time when they had already disappeared. However, does the Bible support the conclusion that the Canaanites were completely expelled? Consider 1 Kings chapter 9 verse 20 to 21. "As for all the people who were left of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites." During Solomon's reign, the Canaanites were still present and were even used as forced laborers in the construction of the temple. Furthermore, in Ezra chapter 9 verse 1, we see that Canaanites were still in the land even during Ezra's time. From this, we can conclude that since the Canaanites remained in the land for centuries, the phrase, "the Canaanites were then in the land," does not necessarily indicate a later authorship of Genesis. This expression does not serve as evidence that the text was written long after Moses' time, nor does it undermine his authorship. "The Canaanites were then in the land" only provides the information that when Abram first arrived in Canaan, he found the land already inhabited by the Canaanites, preventing him from taking immediate possession. It cannot serve as a proof that Moses did not write the phrase, "the Canaanites were then in the land." In conclusion, Abraham ibn Ezra raised doubts about Mosaic authorship based on certain phrases, third-person narration, and historical references. However, these elements align with ancient literary conventions and do not necessarily indicate later additions. The phrase "beyond the Jordan" is context-dependent. Third-person writing was common among ancient historians, and passages like Genesis 36:31 and King Og's bed can be understood within their historical setting, while Joshua may have written the final verses of Deuteronomy. The overall authorship of the Pentateuch remains reasonably attributed to Moses.